So my guest today is Gary Elliott. I think Gary will be very well known to most of you. I think I first met Gary about 13, 14 years ago when I was at Bureau 4, but neither of us can really remember when we were preparing for this interview. So that's maybe a good sign, Gary. I don't know. Or maybe
I don't know.
Maybe it's a bad sign. So welcome. Good afternoon.
Afternoon. Hi.
Gary, just a few questions, really. Hopefully we'll keep this reasonably informal, and no doubt there'll be a little bit of humour in here somewhere if it's anything like our usual cups of coffee. So what would you think your lasting memory from this period is going to be?
Do you know, I think it's a really tricky question to start with, because I think you're asking about
my easy, didn't you?
I did, yeah. But I think so many different people have had so many different experiences, I think, and that's across different sectors, obviously, and different areas, and also different people, obviously, within companies as well. I mean, from my own perspective, to be honest, I'm fortunate enough to have my own space. I have my own office at home. I have a house, I have space, I have garden. So, my lasting, I suppose, memory of this is actually that it's been quite enlightening, to actually have time at home, something that, don't actually get much of in the past. But I'm very, very mindful of the many people who have lost people during this kind of awful time. But also, those companies that just have been decimated. The construction industry, actually, I think as a whole has been pretty resilient, unusually, during this kind of situation. And I think, we just got to look at if you look at, pubs, bars, restaurants, hotels, all of those kind of areas where they've just been absolutely decimated during this period. So I think my own kind of experience of this has been actually okay. And our business has been reasonably resilient during this. And I think despite the kind of the uncertainty that's surrounding, obviously, a situation like this, I think, we need to be mindful, I think, of all those that have really suffered badly during this time. And obviously it's an ongoing situation as well, and will continue to be, I think, for many businesses, a real challenge, even as we start to come out of this.
I think we'll all be looking back in a couple of years' time and wondering how we managed to get through it, because it's gone on a lot longer, hasn't it, than anybody could have expected at the beginning. Absolutely. So I did a little bit of research, Gary, and so I guess some of these questions are things that I know are topics that are close to your heart, so hopefully they're not going to be quite as difficult. But I noticed you've been running a program of interviews with industry leaders called Time to Do More. What do you think the lasting legacy of virtual working is going to be for construction and property teams?
Again, I think it sort of varies, I think, across. I mean, from my own perspective, what's interesting is I can sit in 8 meetings a day, 9 meetings a day.
They want you in 8 meetings, Gary.
Well, no, often they don't, but I just sort of just get in here anyway. And I think, in some ways it's been really good. I think it's also sort of focused our minds probably much more, and we probably should have done this before, but it's focused our minds on communication, internal communication and external communication. Whereas, when we were kind of in the office, actually, I was never really in the office. I was out of the office most of the time, running around, spending probably half of my time traveling to and from meetings, getting from one meeting to the next one, and probably not spending very much time in the office at all. And so not actually communicating very much with the team. And for me personally, I've had far more communication. It sounds bizarre, doesn't it? But I've had far more communication with the rest of the team during this period, and that may or may not be a good thing. A good thing. You have to ask the rest of them to know whether that's a good thing or not. But I think from certainly my perspective, it's been a really positive thing. I think that communication and the understanding that we can communicate, and I think going forward, it's just gives you these opportunities to be able to meet with people who perhaps before you would have had to travel halfway around the world to be able to. And I was talking to somebody this morning actually who was in Switzerland, and it's kind of like, well, it's just like I'm talking to you. It made no difference at all, and it was instantly there, instantly be able to talk, perfect connection, all those kind of things. Amazing that you can have that kind of connectivity. Whereas probably if we'd wanted to have that meeting, I would have had to get onto a plane, flown there, and you kind of think actually the impact of that, multiply that many times, the impact of that, the environmental impact of that is crazy. So I think it will have a really positive impact in terms of meetings. clearly there are downsides with it. We all know, I think we're all desperate to kind of get back to talk to real people and to have real meetings and to go for a beer and go for a glass of wine, all the other things that we enjoy doing. But I think if we get the mix right, I think if we use it where it's really beneficial and we do kind of the things that we were doing before, I think actually we could come out of this with a much better solution and a better sort of environmental solution that will solve some of the challenges that we're facing.
Do you think there's a curveball question, but would you anticipate, and this is not meant to be an intrusion into your corporate policy, but more offices? Does it make you think maybe another London office or an office somewhere else in the UK would make sense? Or does it make you realise that the three you've got is actually a good triangular kind of tripod of places to be?
Without giving too much away, we are looking at another one actually. So
I honestly didn't know that.
I didn't know whether you'd done the research on that or not.
No.
So I think the interesting thing is actually it's something that's relatively new. So I can't go into detail right at the moment. But interestingly, we've met that person. We have met physically, but actually we've had a lot of discussions, kind of online as well. And actually the communications between offices far better. As you know, we've got a Nottingham office, and we've completely integrated that office into kind of our office, if you like, the sort of virtual office. And that's been really positive. It's been really positive in terms of the kind of just the culture, getting people kind of engaged with the business as a whole. The tendency is, if you have an outreach, is that it kind of operates, it's out of sight, out of sight, out of whatever the saying is.
So out of mind, I think you're thinking, okay.
Out of mind, that's it. Yeah, I've forgotten about it. It's that kind of benefit, I think, that actually can hopefully come out of this as well. So, I mean, the office generally is a really interesting question. What will the office look like? And I don't know whether you're going to come on to this later, but I think it will have to be much more flexible. I think it will have to be different to the way it used to be. And I think actually, we've already had a couple of people that have moved out of town. With the idea, I think, of sort of, getting a better life-work balance, being able to buy something that's further out, with the expectation that they might have to travel in 2 or 3 times a week, which is kind of, if you're further out, is okay. Doing it 5 days a week is really challenging, but doing it 2 or 3 times a week is kind of okay. So I think it just opens up just so many more opportunities. And the realization is that we don't have to be in the office, although I do think there has to be a kind of unifying, whether it's a day in the office or something where teams meet up and have sort of physical meetings. I think, clearly that side of it is important. But it's going to, as time goes on, I think this will start to sort itself out. And we will see, I guess, what happens. But I do believe that it is a turning point.
So one of the other things that's happened during COVID, nothing to do with COVID, is the issue of the new London plan, and some of the environmental criteria have been tightened up. Do you think that's going to have a big impact now on the work that you're doing?
I think it's massive. I mean, I think, well, we all know.
Oh, very good, very good. Thank you.
we all know sort of the world, the challenges that the world faces. I mean, they are absolutely enormous. I actually sat in something. I sat in a Field and Clegg Bradley event actually last night. I don't know whether you saw it at all, but. No. There were some fascinating talks about sort of some of the kind of the worldwide challenges, and there was just one statistic that stuck in my mind, is that it's estimated that between now and 2050, there's going to be something like 90 billion square meters of new construction, which worldwide, yeah, that's not in London.
Exactly. On Whitfield Street.
Yeah. But that's a staggering statistic when you think about that. And, we have to do things differently. The amount of embodied carbon that is being generated in construction and the amount of carbon that is generated during the use, for cooling and heating, all the rest of it, all the other sort of operational side of, it's just absolutely staggering. The numbers are so vast. And I think it's absolutely great that, a number of the kind of the big London estates have set targets, proper targets of net carbon zero by 2030, obviously. And I think, the conversations that I'm having with many of those, and we'll come on to some of the details of that in due course, it's just fantastic to hear. And I remember sort of talking to a number of clients probably 3 or 4 years ago about this stuff and kind of just being looked at like I was slightly crazy. And now it's definitely different. There is a real desire to make sure that everything we're doing is really considered. So embodied carbon as absolutely kind of being a sort of a key issue. But I think it's also really thinking about the hierarchy that comes from the circular economy, and thinking much more closely about not just kind of knocking stuff down, because that's kind of what we've always done, and then just rebuilding it and trying to perhaps rebuild it with materials that are perhaps slightly better. That's not good. That's just less bad. What we're trying to do is do it so we really think about, should we do anything? Is the starting point. And I know I'm potentially kind of shooting myself in the foot as an engineer in the construction industry. I'm shooting myself in the foot, but we have to ask that question: should we be doing anything in this? Secondly, can we, if we have to do something, then can we do the absolute minimum, which allows the materials that are on the site to be reused either in situ or on that site? And if we can't do that, then can those materials then be used somewhere else? And this is not about recycling, this is about reuse. And then, only finally, if you've got absolutely no other option, do things get sort of downcycled into being recycled? And that is the kind of the key aspiration. And this is starting, and so the question started from, I suppose, is policy starting to change? And are we starting to see, and absolutely, yes. It's starting to come through in planning policy. We've got a number of projects where these questions we're having to do, full circular economy assessments and looking at, the whole life cycle. Planning is going to drive this. And we're already having to kind of look very closely at should we be taking buildings down and having to demonstrate very, very clearly about why we think it has to be taken down. But then when we put it back, making sure that we're looking into the future so that those buildings can be dismantled in the future, much more easily dismantled than many of the buildings that we're dealing with at the moment. And as we know, reinforced composites, particularly reinforced concrete, for example, it's difficult to, or if not impossible, to take out and reuse as a kind of complete element in its highest level. And so, there's actually, already we're being challenged on projects about, if you're designing in concrete, it means it can't be dismantled in the future. So we should be relooking at that in materials that can be taken down and reused, or repurposed and sort of give flexibility within the existing buildings without having to demolish and downcycle. So I think this is a really big shift. In the UK, we only have a very small impact. I mean, this is the trouble. I think, the UK only accounts for about 1% of all man-made CO2. So it has a very, very tiny kind of actually direct impact. But what the UK has the ability to do is to influence what the rest of the world does.
Is a key word.
And so I think for me, actually, these drives are nothing but fantastic. And I think the more that we can do to try and really demonstrate that we in the UK, and I think it's more prevalent in London probably at the moment, and it's going to widen out into the UK. But the more that we can demonstrate that we're applying these principles, the circularity principles, and thinking very carefully about how we can put new materials in where we have to that are really low embodied carbon, the more that we can start to say, look, we're doing it, and actually, influence some of the rest of the world.
You mentioned earlier some of the initiatives that you are involved in. I know you've mentioned in the past work that you're doing for Grosvenor. Do you want to just explain where that's getting to at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've done a fascinating piece of work with Grosvenor. So it's been a kind of a complete sort of joint venture on circular economy. So there's various sort of strands to this, and there are other parties involved with it as well. The bit that we've been really looking at is materials reuse. And there's been sort of sections on material passports as well, and sort of availability of materials and the like. So there's various different strands. But the piece we're doing is material reuse. So it's looking at how can we kind of understand what's in our buildings, and sort of talking about trying to bring what normally happens, what are called demolition audits, normally happens sort of right at the end of the process, kind of bringing those right to the front of the process so they become sort of more like asset audits rather than demolition audits. And so it's really understanding kind of what's in your building, right, even before you start to think about the design, so that you can then start to think about your design in the terms of how can you reuse those materials that are sitting within that building, either in situ within the building, or even to other sites in terms of reuse. And you can't do that unless you know what's inside. So that's something that the sort of really interesting piece that came out of that, and some technologies and some ways of being able to achieve that without having to sort of go in and do massive opening up works. which obviously often isn't possible. So, looking at sort of non-destructive techniques to allow that to happen. So our research has looked at that, and then it's looked at how do you sort of quantify that and how do you link it into BIM, and then sort of how might that in the future be utilized, how it links into material passports, as we've talked about, how it links into kind of a database of some sorts, which is yet to be established and yet to be, where people can go and buy effectively secondhand materials.
Do you see a business opportunity for the likes of you or for Allied? I mean, I sense that our friends in the contracting world, these are opportunities where some of the demo.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think there is absolutely a business case. I think it's one of those things where there's actually a lot of investment needed to get to a point where there's a sort of critical mass for it to work. I think probably demolition contractors, and we've been talking to several. I think demolition contractors are the obvious sort of first call, I suppose, because they are the people who are generally dismantling buildings, or at the moment knocking them down.
Yeah.
But in the future, the thing. In fact, we asked the question to demolition contractors. Said, can you, or sort of why don't you take elements out that can then be reused? And they said, well, because nobody asks us to. And actually, sort of part of the reasoning behind that is obviously because it's initially very cost driven and program driven.
Yeah.
And I think actually probably what has to happen is some of that, and this again came from the research, is that perhaps some of the metrics have to change a bit. So actually, the embodied carbon savings and, the kind of the other benefits that come from actually sort of dismantling buildings and having those materials stored somewhere that then can be reused, there has to be a kind of a way of, and whether it's taxation or something else, I don't know, but, whether there has to be some way of kind of creating a carrot where, it makes more sense for people to be able to take things out. I mean, at the moment, a steel beam, for example, I mean, it's cut up into small sections on site generally so that it can be manhandled out. That's the sort of the standard approach, rather than actually dismantling it and then lifting it out, because, lifting it out actually means you've got to have more craneage and it's therefore slightly more expensive. So, but it just takes a little shift in the kind of in the approach and looking at the big picture. Suddenly you can get a completely different answer. So I think demolition contractors, I think, will be probably the first point of call. I think then there's almost, are they going to be the middleman? And I suppose what we think needs to happen is that there has to be a kind of middleman that says, I'm going to take those materials, I'm going to store them, I'm then going to test them, and I'm going to recertify them, and I'm then going to put them into a database ready for remarketing. And I think that's the bit that really doesn't exist at the moment. So
it's eBay, isn't it? Almost.
Well, I think it could, it could be eBay, or it could be a number of the big set of distributors, I suppose. In terms of the technology that's there about distribution systems, and but there is the requirement, I think, and a lot of people ask about insurance and about how do you deal with the insurance of secondhand materials. Well, it's very simple. You just make sure you test it and you recertify it so that it's actually like buying a new piece of material, but it just happens to be secondhand. And actually sort of using a piece of secondhand material in terms of embodied carbon is so much better than using a new piece. I mean, we're actually looking at a project at the moment where we found some secondhand steel work, some secondhand steel tubes, and we're looking at utilizing those secondhand steel tubes into a project because the carbon reductions are so substantial, even though it's not a huge project, just even on that small amount, reusing steel that's not, the crazy thing is you take a steel column out of a building, it gets smelted down and then it gets recast into a piece of steel that goes into a building. And you kind of go, that's just nuts. Why don't you just cut out the process and take a piece of steel from one building and put it into another, understanding that you have to, there are technical aspects of being able to reuse that piece of material. It has to be tested. It has to be,
isn't it? It's an emotion.
Yeah, and I think government, it is. But this ultimately, I think, has to be, as I said, it needs a carrot from government to make it happen, and it needs government investment, because it's too big a thing in a way for any one company to take on. It's and it needs such a big investment, and it needs to be a cross industry approach, But look, believe you me, I believe it's coming. I think the thinking is there. I think it's happening. I think it's coming. I think we have the opportunity to utilize all sorts of materials that come out of buildings. And whether they can be repurposed on site or repurposed for others, and actually, it's great. Like people, the likes of Grosvenor, are actually at the moment kind of looking at it for their estate, and actually they're talking to other estates as well. So that when they know that they've got a building that's being demolished or being sort of refurbished or whatever is happening, those materials are logged. Where those materials are. When they're coming free. They then become available for other areas on their estate. or potentially for the kind of the wider estates. And so you can see it sort of happening and working physically, let's say in London amongst the estates, where we start to see this actually happening and start to see the benefits of it. And then, and you can't do this all at once, clearly, but you can see it happening on a relatively small scale, and then building and building and building. And I think it's really exciting. I think it's so exciting because that, will start to change the mindset of construction in terms of just this, this linear, just take it out of the ground, use it and throw it away, which is just something we have got to completely move away from.
So one of the other areas, Gary, that I know we've talked about in the past is that in a kind of the same way is threatening and has been threatening for some time to change construction. Is the dreaded three letters of BIM. I suppose worse than COVID, isn't it? People love to talk about it, but going on a bit. What do you see at the moment? Is there resistance, do you think, to the wider use of more digital technologies? Are you seeing breakthroughs in your own business? I know you've got bite-sized BIM running at the moment. Is that something that's throwing up interesting examples of where little by little things can be improved?
Yeah, I think BIM is a very, very underutilized tool, if you like, or whatever you want to call it. At the moment, it's kind of seen, I think, as something that you produce three-dimensional drawings and you coordinate and you kind of create a digital twin, I suppose, which is kind of trying to create the building before you built it so that you kind of know what's going. I think that, talking about all the stuff that we've talked about, which is carbon and, kind of the circular economy and those side of things, actually, I think that's where the future of BIM is, really. I think, because I think it's how do you use BIM to start to inform the ability to kind of make those things happen? So, for example, if you've got an existing building, you can create a BIM model of that actually then, from the BIM model, contains all of the information about all of the individual elements that go into that. That BIM model can then go into, effectively becomes a list of materials that then go into a database, that then kind of, so you can start, so if you, and it's the same with sort of all aspects of BIM and all the things that go into BIM, you've got to know what you want to get out of it at the end before you start putting it in at the beginning. And from our side, I suppose what we're trying to do with BIM is trying to demystify it a bit. It's become overly complicated, overly clunky, and doesn't achieve the goals of what clients want. And I think largely that's because it starts with a very complex process, and the questions, the right questions of understanding from clients what they actually want out of it at the end, and teasing that out before you kind of do anything, and then setting the whole sort of program around, okay, that's what we want to get out, that's what we need to put in to allow that to come out at the end, and naming the various aspects of it accordingly is the kind of absolutely critical part of it. And I think, if we just go in and we try to create this enormous piece that just covers everything, it just won't happen. It's too complicated, it's too challenging, and actually most of the information that goes in will never be used. So if it's not useful, don't do it. Only it's a very simple thing. Only if it's useful should you be doing it. And I think that's where BIM has fallen down. To be honest, it's been seen as a sort of quite simplistic tool, and actually it's an amazing enabler if you use it intelligently and don't overcomplicate it. And I think, I see some of the some of the sort of the BIM protocol stuff that comes through, and it just is mind-boggling. Even sort of guys in the office are looking at it and going, I don't understand half of this. So how do you expect a client to understand it? It's kind of crazy. So so I suppose the whole meaning or the whole purpose behind the program we're running on bite-sized BIM at the moment is to try and simplify it, demystify it, keep it simple, demonstrate what the high-level sort of aims are, and hopefully, gradually it will kind of filter through to the industry. I think it's a brilliant tool, and it has amazing capabilities and capacity to really help with all the things we've been talking about.
Do you think there's a pulling together some of the strands of what you've just been talking about over this chat? It feels to me, and I have done for a while now, that all of these challenges are going to result in the way that teams are structured and responsibilities in teams are going to change. Do you think there's a dawning? I mean, the perennial problem in construction teams is that we never get to work together twice. We're lucky enough, we've worked on a couple of occasions, but with different clients and different contexts, different sizes of projects. Do you think we're moving anywhere closer to having the ability to give clients teams that are, individuals that have worked well together previously coming forward as a unified team? Or is that, because all of these initiatives, whether it's sustainability, whether it's the circular economy, whether it's BIM, work better if you're working with like-minded individuals, don't they, who kind of thought it through on the first project, and the second project it starts to deliver the return. But
hugely. I think if you've got a winning team, you've got a team that work well together, then and they get on well and they understand each other and they've got the same vision and the same kind of aims. It always creates but for me it starts with the client, actually. It starts with the client. The client's got, and we all know that we have good and bad clients, and you kind of see. But
no, we only have good clients, Gary. Only have good clients.
Not only good clients. But we've all seen that, and it's so essential that the client sets the ambition.
Yeah.
And I think and it's like everything in life, really. If you've got a clear vision and a clear goal, and and a clear sort of ambition of where you want the project to go, then it's amazing, and it tends to work all the way through the process. And when it starts badly, it usually just gets worse. So I think I'm a big fan of obviously having teams, and obviously most of our major clients have a small number of teams that they work with, for that very reason, because it makes sense. I think that this leads into the whole procurement question as well, and and actually, I'm a big fan of getting engagement of contractors much earlier in the process as well. And I think one of the biggest challenges that the industry faces is that we all sit in our ivory towers, don't we? We kind of do our design, and not surprisingly, we pass it on to a contractor who's had no involvement in the process. He gets it at stage 4. We've done our design, thank you very much. He looks at it and goes, well, I wouldn't have done it like that. So straight away, because you'll have a few different inevitably. And there's no right or wrong way necessarily. I mean, there are perhaps better and worse ways, but anyway, but there's no right or wrong way.
Right.
So it's kind of crazy that we're in this situation where the contractor's not involved or engaged in the process until so far down the line. I understand the commerciality of that, the commercial challenges with that. But the best projects that we've worked on, and we've worked on some really complex, challenging projects where actually, the engagement of both parties and sort of understanding the kind of the issues and the constraints and the challenges of those that have got to build it and those that have got to design it. Getting that perspective from both parties kind of really early on in the process is so beneficial. And I actually think, if we're really honest, if you get a smooth project that goes well because everybody's working together and it's collaborative, it will actually be more cost effective than a situation where it is competitive.
Yeah.
And so I suppose my argument is always, yes, there's a commercial aspect to it, but what you really want to get a project to happen on time and on budget and kind of all the rest of it is everybody working together, and therefore bringing the contractor in earlier, the right contractor in earlier, to get their proper and full engagement, I think is a really positive thing for the industry.
So one final question, and it's slightly tongue-in-cheek. Planes or trains?
Well, that's an interesting question as well. So I suppose actually I'd expand that out. Is it trains, planes, or screens?
Or automobiles?
Or automobiles, yeah, indeed. Look, if it's a straight question between trains and planes, it's got to be trains. From an environmental perspective, trains are much better. We know that. Planes are extremely intensive from a CO2 perspective. So I think trains is the simple answer. But I think we've just got to be more intelligent about how we travel, and do we need to travel?
Great, that's a really positive upbeat. Wasn't quite the positive upbeat I was imagining we might have at the end of this hour or half hour, but that's very kind of you to make time, as ever.
It's a pleasure.
It's been my pleasure talking to you, and I appreciate your time. I know you're a busy man, so thank you very much. And I look forward to being able to have those sorts of catch-ups over a real cup of coffee or beer or lunch or something.
Oh, that sounds great.
Not too far away now, but
I'll drink to that, definitely.
Thank you very much, Gary.
Cheers.